What's up, everybody? This is Caleb Rundell, and this is your video for Acts chapter 18. Now, there is a lot of travel and names dropped in here, so we're going to start off with our map, and I'm going to leave this map up for a bit so you can take a look at all the place names because there is a lot of territory covered here in chapter 18 and a lot of places mentioned. So we're going to leave this map up for a bit. Again, this map just comes from the Wikipedia article for Acts 18, and I checked these out. They're accurate. They're pretty great. It saves me from having to make them, which does take a lot of time. So thank you to Wikipedia and whoever made this sweet map for Acts 18. All right. In verse 1, Paul... and just Paul, no one else, but Paul, apparently solo, leaves Athens for Corinth. Now, Corinth figures a lot here in Acts and also the book, the letters of Paul to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. So Corinth is a pretty important place, and that's because Corinth, just due to its geography on a peninsula between two bodies of water and connecting two major portions of Greece, Corinth is a center of trade and travel where people from all over the Eastern Mediterranean and that area of the world would cross paths and stay and everything. So Corinth, for its time, is a pretty cosmopolitan and global place. And here is a map so you can see that and just how unique its geographic position is on trade routes and travel and that sort of thing. So Corinth, big deal. And we see that here where people from all over the place are gathering in Corinth, including Paul. Okay, so back to the big map. Now, in verse 2, to start off, Paul meets two people, Priscilla and Aquila, and they are Jews and they have been expelled from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. Claudius was emperor of Rome from the years 41 to 54, and that's attested to in all of the histories. However, the historical record on any particular expulsion or treatment of Jews in Rome is a little lacking, but take that for whatever it's worth. Now, Paul meets them, and apparently we learn now Paul is a professional tent maker by trade. That hasn't come up before in the story, but we hear about it now. And Paul joins in the business of making tents, and every Sabbath, as is his custom, goes to the synagogue still. Also at this time, Silas and Timothy, who had been up north in Macedonia, show up there in Corinth. And in the synagogue there with the Jewish community, Paul has what unfortunately has become a typical experience where he gets a mixed reaction. Some people respond positively. Some people respond with a lot of hostility. And then in verse 6, Paul proclaims, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to Gentiles from now on. Apparently. So that's what's happening there in the beginning. And then 18 months go by, a year and a half, Paul is in Corinth doing that. In verse 12, after those 18 months, we meet a Roman official, a proconsul named Gallio, who is in charge of the whole area around Corinth, which would be a pretty important posting in the Roman Empire. Way more important than being posted to Jerusalem or Judea like Pontius Pilate. And Gallio, following in what we see from Roman officials throughout the New Testament, Gallio shows some official indifference where he says to the Jews, like, this is about names and ideas and thoughts that I, as a Roman, have zero concern about. So I don't care about this at all. This sounds like y'all's problem. Get out of here. And that very much sounds like the way Pontius Pilate treated the trial and the accusations of Jesus that is brought to him in Holy Week. Just doesn't care. This is not my concern. Okay. In verse 17, we hear about this episode where they're in the kind of court of Gallio. Somebody beats up the leader of the synagogue, whose name is Sosthenes. Very Greek name, probably not pronouncing it anywhere near correct. Now, it is not clear in the text who they are. We don't know if it's maybe Greek citizens of Corinth who are trying to gain favor from the Roman proconsul Gallio by beating up this troublemaker just for wasting his time. We don't know if it's disappointed people from the synagogue just getting some violent revenge, we don't know who the they is that beats up Sosthenes there in the kind of the tribunal area for Gallio. But here's something interesting. There is a person named Sosthenes, same name, is mentioned by Paul in the opening of First Corinthians, verse 1, chapter 1. Now, the odds of that name occurring and being mentioned in kind of the same context, probably a little low, so same person, assumedly. So we might conjecture that this person who gets beat up and being a leader of the synagogue at some point becomes a member of the church, the way, and is mentioned in this letter from Paul. Now, we don't get the details or the backstory on that. We just get these two dots to connect. So, could be an interesting story there, but unfortunately, we don't have that story. Okay. Now, after Gallio continues his difference, Paul decides, that's it, I'm taking off. I got other places to be. And he leaves Corinth to head back to home base in Antioch in Syria. Okay, now something interesting is mentioned in verse 18. It mentions that Paul gets a haircut, and it doesn't tell us the backstory on that. So we got to connect some dots on this one. So remember, Paul, like a lot of the people we've met so far, are very observant Jews. Paul was a Pharisee, is still very much going to the synagogue every week. And so this vow that he had taken, we can assume, is of a religious nature. And the vow had been you don't get to cut your hair, and probably had some other restrictions. And this is most likely what's called a Nazirite vow that comes from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew scriptures, Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. You can go check that out for yourself. So apparently, this time of devotion, this time of this vow, kind of like this season of Lent that we're in now, possibly some similarities. This time of devotion was over, and so it was now time to get a haircut because he had spent this whole season not cutting his hair. Now, why the writer mentions that and doesn't say anything more is interesting, but just a weird little detail that's in there that Paul gets a haircut. Yeah. Now, Paul is headed to Antioch, but doesn't go straight there. He goes first to the port of Caesarea and then to Jerusalem, and then up to Antioch, and then goes all through the area around Antioch. And we're going to, and here we'll bring the map back up. Now, there is a lot of travel and a lot of time that is condensed here into these 4 verses of 20 through 23. Like, that's mentioning a lot of territory and giving no detail about what's going on in those places. So we can assume now that the writer of the book, remember we had switched to first person pronouns, we, back in 16, we no longer have that. So apparently the author is no longer part of the story, at least at this point. And these are details, again, we don't get. All right, so we're kind of done with Paul for the moment. In verses 24 through 28, we meet Apollos. Apollos, a great Greek name from the sun god Apollo. So this person has this great Greek name, Apollos. They come from Alexandria, which is the main center of learning in the known world at that time, and has been for centuries, going back to Alexander the Great. There's the great library at Alexandria, a center for Jewish learning, Greek learning, philosophical learning, secular learning, just if it was about learning, Alexandria was at the center of it for that entire known Roman, Greco, Mediterranean world. Okay. In verse 25, a word that we have seen throughout the book is used again, and that word is the way, the horos, or the hadas, however it's pronounced. And it's used here in talking about the way of God. And that is the term, remember, that is used for the early church. Before the term Christian is used, they're known as the way. Now, it mentions here that Apollos, while doing his preaching, has only known the baptism of John. And a reminder that that means Apollos has only been baptized with water by some other believer or leader in the church, but has not yet had a Pentecost-like experience of the Holy Spirit that we've seen others experience in the book of Acts so far. You can think of Paul and Cornelius from chapter 10 and how the household of Cornelius receives the Holy Spirit. Apollos has not had that yet. Now, Apollos is also mentioned by Paul in 1 Corinthians. So we see a lot of connections between the stories going on here around Corinth and the people here in chapter 18 and connections to the book of 1 Corinthians. So the Bible's like that sometimes. Sometimes it just really kind of fits together. This is one of those times. All right. So that's what's going on as we end chapter 18. We will hear more. In chapter 19, Paul continues his travels and is headed back to the area around Ephesus. And then things get wild. All right. Thanks for tuning in. Check out our video next for chapter 19.